George was 68 when it happened. A retired high school history teacher, he had always been the type to keep moving. Morning walks around the park, tending his vegetable garden, meeting old colleagues for coffee on Fridays. His voice carried the kind of calm wisdom only a lifetime of teaching could give. People admired his gentle humor and the way he could tell a story that made history feel alive. But last spring, something began to change. It was subtle at first, so subtle that even George, a man who paid attention to details, barely noticed. He started waking up with a dull ache in his upper back, just between the shoulder blades. At first, he brushed it off as nothing more than the stiffness of age. He would stretch, shrug his shoulders, and carry on with his day. But the ache lingered. It didn't vanish after his walks. It didn't fade after a good night's sleep. In fact, some nights it seemed to grow worse, keeping him awake, leaving him restless. George told himself it was just the price of getting older, another small discomfort to be endured. Then came the indigestion. It wasn't unusual for George to feel a bit heavy after a big Sunday dinner, but this was different. Even light meals left him with a burning sensation and a strange, bloated feeling. He tried antacids, cut back on coffee, even skipped his beloved spicy chili. Nothing seemed to help. Days turned into weeks, and the discomfort persisted. Still, he reasoned, it was probably nothing serious. After all, he had always been healthy. No major illnesses, no surgeries, no family history of cancer. It wasn't until his daughter Emily came for a visit that someone else noticed. They were sitting at the kitchen table when she suddenly said, "Dad, your eyes look a little yellow. Have you seen yourself in the mirror today?" George laughed it off, but later that evening, he checked under the warm glow of the bathroom light. Emily was right. There was a faint yellow tinge not only in his eyes, but also in his skin. It unsettled him in a way the back pain and indigestion never had. A few days later, George stepped onto the bathroom scale. He had lost 6 pounds without trying. The number seemed odd, but part of him was almost pleased. Finally shedding the winter weight, he thought, but when he mentioned it to Emily over the phone, her tone shifted. "Dad, that's not normal. You need to see a doctor." The turning point came one Saturday morning in late April. George was trimming the roses in his garden when a wave of exhaustion hit him so suddenly he had to sit down on the grass. His heart was pounding, his arms felt heavy, and the warm spring air seemed thick in his lungs. It wasn't just fatigue, it was a bone-deep weariness that no nap could fix. For the first time, fear began to take root. When he finally saw his doctor, the tests began quickly. Blood work, imaging scans, questions about his symptoms. The results came back faster than he expected, and he was called in for a follow-up. George sat in the small, quiet consultation room, his hands folded in his lap as the doctor entered with a somber expression. "George," she began gently, "we've found something concerning in your pancreas." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and final. She explained there was a mass, likely cancer, and they needed to act quickly. George felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. Pancreatic cancer. The phrase sounded almost unreal, like something that belonged to someone else's story. He thought of his students, of the years spent in classrooms, of the countless essays graded late into the night. He thought of his morning walks, of the smell of fresh soil in his garden. He thought of Emily and her children, and then, quite suddenly, he thought of time, how much of it he might not have. That night, George couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the occasional rustle of leaves outside his window. His mind replayed every moment of the past few months, the back pain, the indigestion, the yellowing eyes, the unexplained weight loss. How could he have missed it? How could something so dangerous hide in plain sight, disguised as everyday discomfort? When the sun finally rose, George made himself a quiet promise. If he had ignored the whispers of his body for too long, he would not ignore them now. He would face this head on. He would learn everything he could. And most importantly, he would share his story, because if these small signs had slipped past him, they could slip past others too. In the weeks that followed, George's life became a series of appointments, consultations, and quiet conversations with his family. Some days were heavy with fear, others were lightened by the laughter of his grandchildren. Through it all, he began to understand something profound. Awareness is not just a tool, it's a shield. The earlier you recognize the danger, the better your chances of fighting back. As a doctor who has seen too many lives altered by late diagnoses, I often think about George's story. He's not alone. I've met countless men and women whose first signs were easy to dismiss, minor aches, changes in digestion, a bit of fatigue. But these quiet warnings, when pieced together, tell a very different story. And when we choose to listen, we can sometimes catch the danger before it's too late. George's journey is still unfolding. There are treatments to consider, adjustments to make, and days when courage feels hard to hold on to. But there's also something powerful in his resolve. He speaks openly now about his symptoms, urging friends, neighbors, and even strangers to pay attention to the small changes in their own health. His hope is simple, that his experience might save someone else's life. And that is where our story begins, because George's path, from those first ignored aches to the moment of truth in the doctor's office, is not just his own. It's a reminder to all of us, especially those in the later chapters of life, that our bodies speak in whispers before they ever scream. The question is, will we be listening? It was a quiet Tuesday morning when George first heard the phrase "silent killer" from Dr. Alvarez. The words landed in the small consultation room like a heavy stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through his mind. He had come in expecting maybe gallstones, maybe a stubborn digestive issue, something irritating, perhaps inconvenient, but certainly manageable. But the way Dr. Alvarez leaned forward, her voice steady but weighted with caution, told him this was something far more serious. "The pancreas," she began gently, "is not a troublemaker you hear from often. It works quietly, doing its job every single day, and most of us don't think about it until it stops working as it should. By the time it complains loudly, the situation is often already advanced." George absorbed the words, but they seemed to hover above him rather than settle in. Silent killer. How could something inside him be plotting harm without giving him a fair chance to fight back? He thought of his morning routines, the smell of fresh coffee, the way the sunlight slanted across the kitchen table, the familiar rustle of the newspaper. Could that same ordinary morning have been hiding this quiet, unseen danger? In his mind, he traced back the last few months, the back pain, the indigestion, the weight loss. He had told himself they were minor, even normal for a man pushing 70. But now, sitting under the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, he began to wonder if they were the first whispers of a threat he hadn't wanted to hear. Emily, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand. "What does this mean, doctor?" she asked, her voice low. Dr. Alvarez explained the basics, not with harsh statistics or clinical detachment, but in the language of someone who knew this was a father and grandfather sitting before her. "It means," she said, "that we have to take this seriously and quickly. We'll need more scans, more tests. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." George's mind flickered to his grandchildren, Daniel with his boundless energy, and little Sophie, who insisted on tea parties with her stuffed animals. He couldn't imagine not being there to see Sophie start school or to teach Daniel how to plant tomatoes in the spring. A quiet panic began to take root, curling in his chest. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready for anything that sounded like it might shorten his time. That evening, back home, George moved slowly through his house. Every room felt the same, yet strangely different, as though he were seeing it with new eyes. The bookshelves he had built himself, the chair where he liked to read on rainy afternoons, the small frame photo of Emily in her graduation gown, they all seemed to whisper about the life he had built and the people he loved. He made himself a cup of tea and sat in the kitchen, the steam rising in thin curls, trying to imagine how to explain this to his brothers without alarming them. As night fell, he found himself pacing the hallway. The phrase "silent killer" kept circling back, an echo he couldn't shake. He thought of friends who had faced illnesses, how quickly some had been taken, how others had fought hard and long. George had always believed that if you listened to your body, you could stay one step ahead. But this had slipped past him, disguised as the everyday aches of getting older. The next day, he met with Dr. Alvarez again, this time for a longer discussion. She spoke about the nature of pancreatic disease, about the difficulty of spotting it early, about how easily the signs could be mistaken for something else. She didn't dwell on survival rates. Instead, she emphasized action. "You have a voice in this," she told him. "You have choices, and right now, the most important thing you can do is not to wait." Her words were steadying, and in them, George felt the first flicker of resolve. He couldn't undo the months he had ignored the signs, but he could decide what to do now. He could choose to fight, to learn, to be present in every decision. He knew the road ahead might be steep and uncertain, but it would be his road. and he would walk it with eyes open. That night, as the house grew quiet, George sat by the window, looking out over his garden. The roses he had pruned weeks ago were beginning to show their first buds. He thought about how, in gardening, you often had to look closely to spot the first signs of trouble. Tiny insects on the leaves, a faint yellowing at the edges. Ignore them, and the problem would spread silently until the plant was beyond saving. But catch them early, and the plant had a fighting chance. He realized then that his own body was not so different from the living things he tended in his backyard. And perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't too late for him either. George's next appointment with Dr. Alvarez was different. The fear of the unknown had settled into something heavier, an awareness that his age was now part of the problem. He sat across from her, listening carefully as she explained why pancreatic cancer seemed to have a cruel preference for those in their later years. "It's not just about age, George," she began gently. "It's about what happens to our bodies over decades. The immune system that once worked like a well-trained guard dog becomes slower, less responsive. The repairs our cells used to make quickly now take longer, sometimes not at all. And after 60, that slowdown means it's easier for certain diseases to slip past the body's defenses." George nodded, remembering the years when he could recover from a cold in just a couple of days. These days, it took longer for his energy to return, even after something minor. He thought of the endless little adjustments he'd made without really noticing, avoiding heavy lifting, pacing himself on long walks, skipping late nights out. It was all part of the natural rhythm of aging, but now it seemed those quiet changes might have left the door open for something far more dangerous. Dr. Alvarez continued, her voice steady. "There's also the accumulation of risk. Every year we live, we're exposed to environmental toxins, pollutants in the air, chemicals in our food, even certain habits we've carried for decades. For some people, it's smoking. For others, it might be heavy drinking in their younger years. The pancreas quietly takes all of that in, year after year. By the time you're in your 60s or 70s, the wear and tear can add up in ways you can't see." That last part hit George harder than he expected. He'd never been a heavy drinker, but he had enjoyed his share of late-night takeout and greasy diner breakfasts back when he was teaching. He'd thought little of it at the time. It was just fuel to get him through grading essays and preparing lessons. Now, in the sterile light of the doctor's office, those old choices felt like small debts that had been quietly collecting interest. As they spoke, George realized that age itself was not the enemy. It was what age represented. It was a long life's worth of tiny battles fought inside his body, and while some people came through relatively unscathed, others found that those battles had left cracks in the walls, places where something as insidious as pancreatic cancer could take hold. Later that afternoon, George met Emily at their favorite cafe. She'd taken the day off work to be with him, sensing he might need company. Over cups of tea, he tried to explain what the doctor had told him. Emily listened quietly, her hands wrapped around her mug, her eyes filled with the same mix of worry and determination he felt. "So it's not just bad luck?" she asked softly. "No," George replied. "It's years of living, I guess. Years of my body doing its best to keep up. And now, maybe it's tired." Emily reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Then we have to help it, whatever it takes." Her words stayed with him long after they'd parted. That evening, George sat at his kitchen table, jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. Not just about his upcoming tests and appointments, but about small changes he could make right now. Cutting back on processed foods, taking longer walks, getting more sleep. He didn't know if they would make a difference at this stage, but he knew one thing. The habits that had carried him here would not be the same ones to carry him forward. It struck him, too, that aging had always been portrayed as a kind of gentle drift into the sunset, a slowing down, a loosening of obligations, a chance to savor the quieter moments. But what no one told you was how much work it took to protect those moments. It wasn't enough to simply avoid getting sick. You had to be proactive, vigilant, almost stubborn in your commitment to staying well. In the days that followed, George began to pay closer attention to the small signs in his body. A wave of tiredness in the afternoon, a heaviness after meals, even the way his skin felt a little drier than usual. He didn't want to spiral into worry, but he also didn't want to dismiss anything. It was a delicate balance, listening without panicking, acting without overreacting. One evening, while reading in his favorite chair, George came across a passage in a gardening book he kept by the window. It talked about how older trees, though strong and deeply rooted, could be more vulnerable to disease if not properly cared for. They needed pruning, regular checks for pests, healthy soil, and sometimes a bit of extra support to keep their branches from breaking. He smiled faintly at the metaphor. At 68, he wasn't so different from those trees. Dr. Alvarez had said something else that stayed with him. George, getting older doesn't mean giving up the fight. It means fighting smarter. It means knowing your risks and working with them instead of pretending they don't exist. And that, George realized, was the heart of it. Pancreatic cancer might be more common and more aggressive after 60, but that didn't mean he was powerless. It meant his awareness, his choices, and his persistence mattered more than ever. The road ahead would be shaped not just by his age, but by what he chose to do with the time and knowledge he had now. As he stood by his garden the next morning, watching the first light spill over the roses, George felt something shift inside him. Fear was still there, yes, but alongside it was a quiet determination. He was not just a patient, not just a statistic. He was George, the man who had spent decades shaping young minds, the man who still found joy in the smell of fresh soil, the man who had people who loved him deeply, and for them, for himself, he would keep listening, keep learning, and keep fighting, no matter how quietly this disease tried to hide. George had always thought of back pain as part of the deal you make with life after 60. Years of leaning over desks while teaching, bending to weed the garden, hauling grocery bags up the front steps. Of course, the body would protest now and then. But this pain was different. It didn't flare only after he'd overdone it. It didn't fade after a day's rest. It was always there, a dull, steady ache tucked deep beneath his ribs, sometimes reaching around to his side, sometimes creeping toward his shoulder blades. At first, he ignored it. A heating pad at night, a few over-the-counter pain relievers, and he could push through his days without much fuss. But over time, he began to notice patterns. It was worse at night when he lay still in bed, and it often woke him in the early hours before dawn. After meals, especially larger ones, the ache would swell until it was almost unbearable. One evening, as he stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, a sharp twist of pain made him drop the sponge back into the soapy water. He gripped the edge of the counter, waiting for the wave to pass. Emily, who had stopped by with the grandchildren, noticed immediately. "Dad, what is it? Did you hurt yourself?" He forced a smile and shook his head. "Just my back acting up again," he said, but she didn't look convinced. Later that night, George sat in his recliner, staring at the muted television. He thought about the years of aches and twinges he had brushed aside, chalking them up to old age. He thought about friends who had gone through back surgeries, slipped discs, pulled muscles, but deep down, he knew this wasn't that kind of pain. This was something deeper, something that felt wrong. The next morning, during his follow-up with Dr. Alvarez, he mentioned it almost as an afterthought. She looked up from her notes. "George, describe the pain to me. Where exactly do you feel it? When did it start?" He hesitated, then explained everything. The timing, the location, the way it worsened after eating and lingered through the night. She listened carefully, her expression tightening. "Back pain can have many causes," she said, "but with what we've already seen in your scans, we have to consider that this pain may not be from your spine or muscles at all. The pancreas sits deep in the abdomen, close to the spine. When there's a problem there, especially something pressing on nerves, it can radiate to the back in ways people don't expect." George sat very still, letting her words sink in. He had been so sure this was just another badge of aging, one of those inevitable discomforts. Now he understood it was more than that. It was a message, sent quietly but insistently from a part of his body he'd never given much thought to before. That evening, he found himself replaying old moments in his mind. The first time he'd felt that dull ache while carrying a bag of compost to the garden, the night it had kept him awake despite all the tossing and turning. He realized now that those moments weren't random. They were connected, each one a clue he hadn't yet learned to read. The pain began to change the rhythm of his days. He walked more slowly, paused more often while tending his plants, avoided lifting even light objects, Emily noticed. "Dad, you're moving like you're guarding yourself," she said gently one afternoon. He nodded. "I guess I am. It's strange. Once you know pain isn't just from a sore muscle, it feels different, heavier somehow." On a rainy Sunday, George sat at his desk with an old journal he hadn't touched in years. He began jotting down every symptom he could remember, dates, times, what he was doing, what he had eaten. It wasn't just for himself, it was for Dr. Alvarez, so she could have the clearest picture possible. It felt oddly empowering, as if he were finally taking an active role in deciphering what his body was trying to tell him. The more he wrote, the more he saw the patterns: back pain after meals, worsening at night, often paired with the indigestion he'd been battling for months. They weren't separate problems after all, they were threads in the same tangled knot. At his next appointment, George handed the journal to Dr. Alvarez. She flipped through the pages, nodding slowly. "This is helpful, George," she said, "and it confirms what we suspected. This isn't random back pain, it's your pancreas asking for attention." Hearing it put so plainly was both frightening and clarifying. The ache in his back was no longer just a shadow in the corner of his life. It was a signal, and now he knew where it came from. He wished he'd understood sooner, but he also knew it wasn't too late to act. That night, he lay in bed, the familiar ache humming through his spine. But this time, he didn't try to push it away. He let himself feel it fully, acknowledging it for what it was: the body's way of speaking, a voice that would no longer be ignored. He thought about the people he cared for: his daughter, his grandchildren, the friends who stopped by with garden cuttings and neighborhood news. He wanted to be here for all of it, and that meant listening, even when the truth was hard to hear. For the first time in months, George felt a strange sense of relief. He didn't have all the answers yet, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. But now, at least, he knew that the pain in his back wasn't just a sign of getting older, it was a sign to fight. Indigestion was something George had lived with before, at least he thought he had. In his teaching years, it wasn't unusual for him to grab a greasy breakfast sandwich on his way to school, or to gulp down black coffee during a morning break. He'd feel that familiar heaviness in his chest afterward, maybe a touch of heartburn, but a few antacids, and it would be gone. This was different. It started with a lingering discomfort after dinner one evening in early spring. He had eaten only a small bowl of vegetable soup and a slice of whole grain bread, nothing heavy, nothing fried, but within an hour he felt bloated and uneasy. The sensation wasn't sharp or stabbing, it was as if a weight had settled in his upper abdomen, pressing down and making it hard to take a deep breath. At first he blamed the soup, perhaps too much onion, maybe a touch of garlic that didn't sit well. But then it happened again, and it didn't matter what he ate, whether it was oatmeal in the morning, a turkey sandwich at lunch, or steamed fish in the evening. The discomfort would come, wrapping itself around his middle like an unwelcome belt. George began adjusting his meals, avoiding rich foods, skipping desserts, even cutting back on coffee. But nothing seemed to help. The indigestion wasn't just showing up, it was staying longer each time, lingering into the night, keeping him from falling asleep. One Saturday, Emily invited him to a small family gathering at her house. She made a light meal: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and fresh fruit. George ate slowly, chewing carefully, determined to avoid the discomfort. But halfway through dessert, a few slices of ripe pear, he felt it creeping in. That familiar heaviness, the tightness, the restless shifting in his seat. Emily noticed. "Dad, are you all right?" she asked. "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Just need to stand up a minute." But inside, he knew it wasn't fine. He could see the worry in her eyes. By the time he got home that night, the discomfort had grown into a dull ache, one that seemed to echo the back pain he had been feeling for months. He sat in his recliner, hand resting over his stomach, trying to make sense of it. Was this just another symptom of age, like slower digestion, or was it something else entirely? When he told Dr. Alvarez about it at his next appointment, she listened without interrupting, her expression serious. "George," she said, "when indigestion doesn't respond to simple changes, when it becomes persistent, it's a sign we need to investigate further. The pancreas plays a role in digestion, producing enzymes that help break down fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. If it's not functioning well, you can feel exactly the way you've described." Her words brought an uneasy clarity. He'd been treating the indigestion like a minor nuisance, but now he realized it might be another piece of the same puzzle. She explained how tumors in or near the pancreas could interfere with digestion, either by reducing enzyme production or by physically blocking the flow of digestive fluids. That night, George did something he rarely did. He sat down at his computer and searched for information. He read about pancreatic enzyme insufficiency, bile duct obstruction, and how early symptoms could look deceptively mild. It was unsettling, but it also gave him a sense of control. The more he understood, the less powerless he felt. In the weeks that followed, the indigestion continued, sometimes mild, sometimes more intense. George began keeping a detailed log, just as he had done for his back pain. He noted the time of day, what he had eaten, how long the discomfort lasted, and whether it was accompanied by nausea or bloating. The patterns were clear. Even the simplest meals could trigger it, and it was often worse in the evening. On some nights, the discomfort was joined by a faint queasiness, though he rarely vomited. On others, it felt as if the food simply sat there, refusing to move along. Emily, who visited often, began cooking gentler meals for him. Pured soups, steamed vegetables, poached fish. She served smaller portions, encouraging him to eat slowly. These gestures touched George more than he could say, but the reality was the discomfort persisted regardless. One quiet afternoon, George sat at his kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, looking out the window at his garden. He thought about how digestion had once been something he never even noticed, how food was simply a pleasure, a source of energy. Now every bite carried with it the question, will this make me uncomfortable? Dr. Alvarez had told him, George, indigestion that doesn't go away is never something to ignore. Sometimes it's the earliest sign the pancreas is struggling. He carried those words with him, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder. His body wasn't trying to make his life harder, it was trying to speak to him in the only way it knew how. One evening, after a particularly uncomfortable dinner, George went out to the garden to clear his head. The sun was setting, casting a warm gold light over the roses and tomato plants. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the earthy scent of soil, letting the air ease the tightness in his chest. And in that moment, he understood something simple but profound. Ignoring the whispers of discomfort is like ignoring weeds in the garden. They might start small, but given time, they will spread, taking over the space where beauty and life should grow. He wasn't going to ignore them anymore. It was Emily who noticed it first. They were sitting at the kitchen table one Sunday morning, sunlight streaming in through the lace curtains, when she suddenly leaned closer and said, Dad, your eyes look a little yellow. George chuckled at first, waving a hand dismissively. Probably just the light, he said. But later, when he went to wash his hands in the bathroom, he caught his own reflection in the mirror. It wasn't just the light. The whites of his eyes had a faint golden hue, and when he looked closer, he saw that his skin seemed to carry the same subtle tint. It unsettled him in a way the back pain and indigestion never had. This was visible, undeniable. It wasn't something he could chalk up to sore muscles or an upset stomach. And yet, a small voice inside him wanted to pretend it was nothing. A quirk of age, maybe a reaction to something he'd eaten. But the truth was harder to ignore. Over the next few days, George caught himself glancing in the mirror more often. Each time, the yellow seemed just a little more pronounced. His face looked tired, as though a shadow had passed over it. When he mentioned it to Dr. Alvarez, she listened quietly, then leaned forward. George, she said gently, yellowing of the eyes and skin, what we call jaundice, isn't something we take lightly. It usually means there's a buildup of bilirubin in your blood, often because something is blocking the bile ducts. In your case, given the scans we've already done, it could be related to what's happening in your pancreas. Her words landed with a heaviness that made George's stomach tighten. She explained how tumors in or near the pancreas could press against the bile ducts, preventing bile from flowing properly. The bile would then build up in the bloodstream, causing the skin and eyes to turn yellow. It wasn't painful in itself, but it was a clear warning that something inside was out of balance. George thought back to the stories he'd heard over the years, people describing jaundice as if it were just another symptom of liver trouble. But now he understood. It wasn't the liver itself, but the intricate plumbing of the body being blocked or squeezed in ways it was never meant to be. In the days that followed, other changes began to appear. His skin itched faintly, not enough to make him scratch constantly, but enough to be a steady irritation. Some mornings his urine was darker than usual, almost the color of strong tea. These details might have seemed small on their own, but together they painted a picture that was becoming impossible to ignore. Emily's concern deepened. Dad, she said one evening, I don't want to scare you, but this isn't just something we can wait out. We have to act. George nodded, appreciating her steadiness. In truth, he had already made up his mind. The yellowing was a sign he couldn't explain away. At the hospital, further imaging confirmed what Dr. Alvarez suspected: a mass in the head of the pancreas pressing on the bile duct. The blockage wasn't complete, but it was enough to cause the changes in his skin and eyes. The news felt both terrifying and clarifying. At least now he knew what was causing the changes. At least now there was a path forward, however uncertain. That evening, George sat at his kitchen table with a mug of tea, the house quiet around him. He thought about how strange it was that such a small change in color could signal something so serious. In his years as a teacher, he had always told his students to pay attention to the smallest details, because they often held the key to understanding the bigger picture. Now he realized his own body had been giving him those details. He just hadn't known how to read them. The jaundice was more than a symptom. It was a visible alarm flashing in the mirror each morning. And as much as it frightened him, it also gave him a sense of urgency that the more hidden symptoms had not. He could no longer drift along, hoping things would resolve on their own. The yellow in his eyes was a line he couldn't step back over. Emily stopped by the next day with a basket of fresh fruit and a stack of medical articles she had printed out. They sat together, reading through them, marking the parts that seemed most relevant. George was struck by how often jaundice was mentioned as one of the first visible signs of pancreatic trouble. He couldn't help but wonder if he had recognized it sooner, could they have caught this earlier? But he pushed the thought away. Regret was a heavy coat, and right now he needed to travel light. What mattered was what he did next. That night, before bed, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror once more. The yellow was still there, perhaps a little deeper now. But instead of turning away quickly as he had before, he looked himself squarely in the eye. He thought of the roses in his garden, how the first sign of disease in a plant was often a change in the leaves, something subtle but unmistakable if you knew what to look for. He had always tended his plants with care, responding to their quiet signals. Now it was time to tend to himself with the same attention. He reached up, touched the corner of his eye lightly, and whispered to his reflection, "I see you, and I'm listening now." It was a small moment, but for George, it marked a shift. The yellow in his eyes was no longer just a frightening change, it was a message, and he was ready, finally, to answer it. George had never been a man obsessed with the number on the scale. In fact, he'd rarely stepped on one unless he was at the doctor's office. His philosophy was simple. If his clothes fit and he could keep up with his daily walks, there was no reason to worry. But over the past few months, something had shifted. At first, he noticed his belt felt looser, and he assumed it was from all the lighter meals he'd been eating since the indigestion began. Then one morning, just out of curiosity, he stepped on the bathroom scale. The number staring back at him made him pause. He was down nearly 6 pounds from the last time he'd checked. "That's not bad," he told himself at the time. "Maybe I'm finally shedding the winter weight." But the loss didn't stop there. 2 weeks later, another 5 pounds had vanished. His once comfortable trousers now sagged at the waist, and even his favorite cardigan hung more loosely from his shoulders. When Emily dropped by for coffee one afternoon, she noticed immediately. "Dad, you're shrinking," she said, half joking but with a furrow in her brow. "Are you trying to lose weight?" He shook his head. "No, it's just happening." She studied him for a moment, her eyes tracing the sharper lines in his face. "Then we need to find out why." At his next appointment, Dr. Alvarez didn't mince words. "George," she said gently, "unexplained weight loss, especially at your age, is never something we ignore. When the body is working harder than usual to fight an illness, it burns more energy. And when the pancreas isn't producing enough enzymes to digest food properly, you can lose weight even if you're eating the same as before." She explained how cancer cells can hijack the body's metabolism, forcing it to burn through calories and muscle at an alarming rate. It wasn't just fat George was losing, it was strength. His hands, once steady and firm, now seemed bonier. His steps felt lighter, but not in a way that gave him energy. The realization hit him harder than he expected. Losing weight without trying might sound appealing to some, but in this context, it was a warning. It meant his body was struggling in ways he couldn't see. George began paying closer attention to his meals, making sure he was eating enough, even when his appetite was low. Emily started bringing over nutrient-dense soups and smoothies, packed with vegetables, beans, and lean protein. She coaxed him to have small snacks between meals, nuts, cheese, slices of avocado. But no matter what he ate, the pounds continued to slip away. One evening, after finishing a small dinner, George sat in his recliner and noticed how the cushion seemed to swallow him more than before. His clothes felt strange on his frame, as though they belonged to someone else. He thought of old photographs from his teaching days, broad-shouldered, full-faced, with a certain vitality in his posture. Now, the man in the mirror looked like a softened sketch of that figure. He tried to keep his spirits up. "At least I'll save on fabric if I need new clothes," he joked to Emily one afternoon. She smiled faintly but didn't laugh. "Dad, I just want you strong," she said quietly. Dr. Alvarez ordered tests to check his nutrient levels and enzyme production. When the results came back, they confirmed her suspicion. His pancreas wasn't producing enough enzymes to properly digest fats and proteins. Without those enzymes, much of the nutrition from his food was simply passing through unused. She prescribed pancreatic enzyme supplements to help his body absorb more nutrients from what he ate. George began taking them with every meal, and though the changes were gradual, he noticed that his energy seemed to level out slightly. Still, the scale continued to edge downward, reminding him that this was not an overnight fix. It wasn't just the weight itself that bothered George, it was what it represented. In his garden, he had always known that when a plant started losing leaves, it was a sign of deeper trouble. You could water it more, feed it fertilizer, but unless you fixed the root problem, the decline would continue. Now he realized he was that plant. One night, as he prepared for bed, he stood in front of the mirror for a long time. The hollows beneath his cheekbones were more pronounced, the slope of his shoulders more visible. He traced a hand along his jawline, remembering how it used to feel fuller, warmer. This was his body's way of telling him, "Something is wrong, and I need your help." Instead of despairing, George chose to see it as a call to action. He couldn't stop the weight from coming off overnight, but he could nourish himself in every way possible, physically, emotionally, spiritually. He began adding short afternoon naps to preserve his energy, walking in the mornings when the air was cool and gentle, and keeping a journal of everything he ate and how he felt afterward. Emily continued to rally around him, bringing groceries, cooking meals, and sometimes simply sitting with him while he ate. Her quiet presence was as nourishing as the food itself. "You're not in this alone," she told him one evening, her voice steady. "Every pound you fight to keep, I'm fighting for with you." In the weeks that followed, George learned to stop seeing the weight loss as just a number on a scale. It was a symptom, a message from deep within. And while he couldn't erase what had already happened, he could respond with care, intention, and a renewed commitment to listening to his body. On a sunny morning in early summer, George stepped into his garden, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath his shoes. He stood among the rows of tomatoes and herbs, noticing how some plants looked stronger than others. The weaker ones needed extra support, more water, perhaps even a bit of shade. He smiled faintly. He understood now, sometimes when something begins to fade, it's not a sign to give up. It's a sign to give more. And that, he decided, was exactly what he was going to do for himself. It was one of those things George never imagined he'd talk about, least of all with his doctor. Bowel habits were private, the sort of topic you politely avoided, even among friends. But in the quiet privacy of his bathroom, he had begun to notice changes he couldn't ignore. It started subtly. His stools looked lighter in color than usual, almost pale tan. Then, over the next few weeks, they began to appear greasy, as if coated with oil. They floated instead of sinking, and when he flushed, they left a film on the surface of the water. It wasn't something he could easily explain away, and it certainly wasn't something he remembered happening before. At first, George told himself it must be something he'd eaten. He experimented, cutting back on dairy, avoiding fried foods, but the changes persisted. On some days, the stools were accompanied by a faint but persistent diarrhea that left him feeling drained and embarrassed. One morning, while tidying up his kitchen, George found himself debating whether to even mention this to Dr. Alvarez. It felt uncomfortable, undignified somehow. But he remembered her words from an earlier appointment. "The small changes you think aren't worth mentioning often tell me the most." So at his next visit, when she asked how he'd been feeling, George hesitated only briefly before speaking up. "Doctor, I've noticed something different in my stools. They've been looking greasy, pale, sometimes even floating." He avoided Emily's eyes as he said it, but Dr. Alvarez didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded, her expression thoughtful. "George, that's important information. What you're describing is called steatorrhea, fat in the stool. It often happens when the pancreas isn't producing enough digestive enzymes to break down fat properly. That can be due to inflammation, blockage, or, as in your case, possibly a tumor affecting pancreatic function. Her calm, matter-of-fact explanation eased some of his embarrassment. She went on to explain that the pancreas produces enzymes like lipase, amylase, and protease, which are essential for breaking down fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. When those enzymes are missing or insufficient, fat passes through undigested, creating the greasy appearance he'd noticed. "It's not just a cosmetic change," she said gently. "It means your body isn't absorbing all the nutrients from your food. Over time, that can lead to weight loss, weakness, and vitamin deficiencies." George realized then that this too was part of the larger picture, just like the back pain, the indigestion, and the weight loss. It wasn't a separate issue. It was another piece of the puzzle his body had been quietly laying out for him. Dr. Alvarez prescribed pancreatic enzyme supplements to take with every meal. She explained that these capsules would help replace what his pancreas wasn't producing, allowing his body to better digest fat and absorb nutrients. "It won't cure the underlying problem," she said, "but it will help your body get more out of the food you're eating." George started the supplements the very next day. He took them religiously, swallowing a few small capsules with his first bite at every meal. Within a week, he noticed a change. His stools began to look more normal, still not exactly as before, but less greasy, less prone to floating. His digestion felt a little smoother, and he wasn't as bloated after eating. Emily, who often joined him for dinner now, noticed the improvement in his energy. "You seem a little brighter," she said one evening as they sat over bowls of vegetable stew. He smiled. "I think my body's finally holding on to the food I give it." But George also understood that this wasn't just about comfort or dignity, it was about survival. Malabsorption could strip the body of strength at a time when he needed every bit of it. The greasy stools had been a clue, and though unpleasant to talk about, they had pointed the way to an important step in his care. One quiet afternoon, George sat in his garden, pruning a few overgrown branches. As he worked, he thought about how in gardening, problems often show themselves in indirect ways. A leaf might turn yellow, not because the leaf itself is sick, but because the roots are struggling to draw nutrients from the soil. The symptom is just the visible part of a deeper issue. That's what the stools had been, he realized, an outward sign of an inner struggle. It was as though his body had been waving a small flag, hoping he would notice. And once again, he was grateful he had chosen to speak up rather than let embarrassment keep him silent. Over the next few weeks, he became more comfortable discussing even the less pleasant aspects of his condition with Dr. Alvarez. She encouraged this openness, telling him, "George, every detail helps me see the whole picture. Nothing is too small or too awkward to mention." It reminded him of a lesson he used to teach his history students, that sometimes the smallest scraps of evidence, a single letter, a faded photograph, could unlock the truth about an entire period of time. In his own health journey, the greasy stools were one of those small scraps, leading him toward answers he might otherwise have missed. By midsummer, George had settled into his new routine: enzyme capsules with meals, smaller but more frequent portions of food, regular walks in the cool morning air. His stools were still not perfect, but they were no longer alarming. More importantly, he was regaining a sense of partnership with his own body, listening, responding, and adjusting as needed. One morning, as he watered his tomato plants, George smiled to himself. The signs had been there all along. The question had never been whether his body was speaking, it was whether he was willing to listen. And now, more than ever, he was. George had never thought much about diabetes. He'd known friends and colleagues who had it. Some pricked their fingers each day, others watched their sugar intake carefully. But it wasn't something he ever imagined would show up in his own life. His annual blood tests had always been fine, and aside from the occasional sweet treat, he didn't have much of a sweet tooth. That changed one early autumn morning. Dr. Alvarez called after reviewing his latest lab work. Her voice was calm but direct. "George, your blood sugar is higher than we'd like. In fact, it's in the diabetic range." He sat in silence for a moment, the phone pressed to his ear. "Diabetes?" he repeated slowly. "I've never had a problem with my sugar before." "That's exactly why I'm concerned," she said. "For someone without a history of diabetes, a sudden onset, especially in your age group, can sometimes be linked to changes in the pancreas." George listened as she explained how the pancreas isn't just a digestive organ, it's also a critical part of the body's blood sugar regulation system. It produces insulin, the hormone that helps move sugar from the bloodstream into the cells for energy. If a tumor grows in or around the insulin-producing cells, it can disrupt this delicate balance. The result? Blood sugar that suddenly spikes, seemingly out of nowhere. As she spoke, George thought back over the past few months. There had been moments he'd felt unusually thirsty, drinking glass after glass of water. At times, he'd woken in the night to use the bathroom more often than usual. He'd brushed it off as part of aging, or maybe just the warmer weather. But now, he realized these could have been the earliest hints that something was wrong. A few days later, George sat in Dr. Alvarez's office for a follow-up. She explained that sudden diabetes in someone his age without a family history can sometimes precede a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer by months. It's not always the case, she reassured him, but in your situation, it fits the larger picture we're seeing. The words settled in his mind, heavy but clarifying. This wasn't just another unrelated health issue. It was another piece of the same puzzle he'd been trying to assemble since the back pain began. Dr. Alvarez started him on a low-dose medication to help control his blood sugar. She also gave him a small glucose meter and taught him how to check his levels at home. George wasn't thrilled about the idea of pricking his finger every morning, but he understood the importance. This isn't just about numbers, she told him. It's about understanding how your body is responding day by day. The first week, his readings were consistently high. George began to notice how certain meals made the numbers climb even more. He adjusted, cutting back on refined bread and pasta, adding more vegetables and lean proteins. Emily jumped in to help, showing up with containers of roasted vegetables, quinoa salads, and baked fish. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Emily asked, "Does it bother you, Dad? The diabetes diagnosis?" George thought for a moment. It bothers me in the sense that it's one more thing to manage. But mostly, it's just another sign my body's trying to get my attention. It's telling me there's a bigger battle going on. The shift in perspective helped. Instead of viewing diabetes as an isolated problem, he saw it as part of the warning system his body had been sounding for months. And in a strange way, he was grateful for it, because it was yet another reason to act quickly, to stay engaged with his care, and to make choices that could give him more time. Over the next few weeks, George became surprisingly adept at managing his blood sugar. He tested himself each morning, jotting down the numbers in a small notebook. He learned which foods gave him steady readings and which sent them soaring. He even began to feel a small sense of control again, something that had been missing since the whirlwind of tests and diagnoses began. But he never forgot the reason behind it all. One afternoon, while tending his garden, he thought about how some plants give subtle hints they need attention, drooping leaves, slowed growth, while others send up glaring red flags like sudden yellowing or a fungal bloom. The diabetes, he realized, was one of those glaring flags. It wasn't something to hide or downplay. It was a signal to pay attention, right now. During his next visit, Dr. Alvarez looked over his glucose log and smiled faintly. "You're doing well, George. You're learning how to read your body's signals. That's half the battle." He nodded, feeling a quiet pride. This new diagnosis hadn't been welcome, but it had deepened his awareness of just how connected every part of his health truly was. And in this fight, awareness was one of his strongest tools. That night, as he sat by the window watching the last light fade over the garden, George thought about the road ahead. Diabetes was now part of his story, but it was also a reminder that his body still had ways to warn him, to guide him, to keep him fighting. And for that, he was oddly thankful. Fatigue had crept into George's life quietly, like an unwelcome guest who never announced their arrival. At first, it was nothing more than a heavy yawn mid-morning or the temptation to lie down for a quick nap after lunch. He told himself it was normal. After all, wasn't slowing down part of getting older? But as the weeks passed, the tiredness grew heavier, more stubborn. He could wake from a full night's sleep only to feel as though he hadn't rested at all. Simple tasks, watering the garden, walking to the corner store, even carrying a basket of laundry, began to feel like climbing a steep hill. One Saturday morning, George stepped outside with his watering can and barely made it halfway across the yard before stopping. His legs felt leaden, his breath shorter than it should have been. He set the can down and sat on the low garden wall, head bowed, letting the cool air wash over him. It wasn't just physical tiredness, it was as if his energy had been stolen from somewhere deep inside. Emily noticed it too. "Dad, you've been resting more than usual," she said one afternoon when she stopped by. "You used to walk circles around me at the farmer's market. Now you look wiped after 10 minutes." "I'm just pacing myself," George replied, though he knew it wasn't the truth. Rest didn't fix this kind of tired. No matter how long he napped, the heaviness clung to him, refusing to lift. At his next appointment, he mentioned it to Dr. Alvarez. She leaned forward, listening intently. George, this kind of fatigue is common in many serious illnesses, including pancreatic cancer. Your body is working overtime to fight the disease, manage inflammation, and deal with changes in your metabolism. It's like running a marathon you never signed up for. She explained that cancer-related fatigue was different from ordinary tiredness. It wasn't simply a matter of being overworked or under-rested. It was a deep, whole-body exhaustion that rest alone couldn't cure. Add to that his recent weight loss, nutrient malabsorption, and now diabetes, and it was no wonder he felt drained. George listened quietly, nodding. It made sense, but knowing the reason didn't make it any easier to accept. He had always been a man who took pride in keeping busy, in being dependable. Now, even small chores left him feeling as if he'd done a day's work. Determined not to surrender completely to the fatigue, George began to make small adjustments. He moved more slowly through his mornings, giving himself extra time to dress and eat breakfast. He learned to group his tasks so he could rest in between, sitting down with a cup of tea after loading the washing machine or watering only part of the garden at a time. Emily encouraged him to let go of certain things altogether. "The world won't fall apart if you don't vacuum today," she said with a smile. And though it went against his instinct to leave things undone, George found that letting go was its own form of relief. Still, there were days when the fatigue felt overwhelming, pressing down like a heavy blanket he couldn't shake off. On those days, he sat by the window and watched the sunlight move slowly across the floor, reminding himself that it was okay to simply be still. One afternoon, as he dozed in his recliner, a memory surfaced from his teaching days. He'd once told a group of restless students that pacing themselves during an exam was as important as knowing the answers. "Don't burn all your energy on the first page," he'd advised them. "Leave something for the last question." Now he realized he was taking his own advice in the most personal way possible. This illness was his exam, and he needed to conserve his strength for the long journey ahead. Dr. Alvarez suggested gentle activities to keep his muscles engaged without draining him completely. Short walks in the cool of the morning, light stretching, even tending a single flower bed instead of the entire garden. Activity can help fight fatigue, she explained, but it has to be the right kind of activity, gentle, restorative, and balanced with rest. George took her advice to heart. Some mornings, he walked slowly to the park, stopping at his favorite bench under the old elm tree. He'd sit there for a while, watching the dogs chase balls and the children race across the grass before making his way home. Other days, he stayed closer to the house, clipping a few roses or sweeping the front steps, feeling satisfied with these small but meaningful accomplishments. He also discovered that moments of connection could be as restorative as sleep. A phone call with an old friend, a shared laugh with Emily, or reading aloud to his grandson Daniel seemed to lift the fatigue, if only for a little while. It reminded him that energy wasn't just a physical thing, it was emotional too. One evening, as the sky deepened to a soft indigo, George sat in his garden with a blanket around his shoulders. He looked at the flowers swaying gently in the breeze and thought about how they rested through the night, gathering strength for the day ahead. He realized that perhaps his own body was asking for the same grace, to slow down, to be gentle, to accept that rest was not weakness, but part of healing. In that moment, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would stop measuring his worth by how much he got done in a day. Instead, he would honor his body's pace, listening to its signals and giving it what it needed. Because in this season of his life, conserving strength wasn't about giving up, it was about holding on. Nausea had never been much of a problem for George before. In his younger years, he could enjoy a big Sunday roast, a spicy curry, or even the occasional diner cheeseburger without a second thought. His stomach was steady, reliable, something he never had to worry about. But lately, that had changed. It began quietly, just a faint queasiness after certain meals. At first, George brushed it off as a side effect of eating too quickly or not chewing enough. But over time, the queasiness became a regular visitor, showing up after almost every meal, no matter how light. Even a simple breakfast, oatmeal with a few slices of banana, could leave him unsettled, as though the food had nowhere to go. Lunch might bring a wave of heaviness in his gut, followed by that uneasy rolling sensation in his stomach. By dinner, the thought of eating again sometimes made him hesitate altogether. One evening, after a bowl of vegetable soup, George found himself gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, breathing slowly to keep the nausea at bay. Emily, who had been tidying up nearby, noticed. "Dad, are you all right?" she asked, concern etched across her face. "Just a bit off," he murmured, trying to wave her worry away. But she didn't miss the pale look in his cheeks or the way he lingered by the sink as though afraid to move too quickly. When he told Dr. Alvarez about it at his next appointment, she listened closely. "Nausea after meals can happen when the pancreas isn't producing enough enzymes to digest food properly," she explained. "It can also occur if there's a blockage in or near the stomach, which can sometimes happen when a tumor presses on surrounding organs." The words made sense to George. He remembered how, over the past few months, it often felt as though food was just sitting in his stomach, not moving along the way it should. It was an oddly claustrophobic feeling, like his body's digestive system was slowing down against his will. Dr. Alvarez suggested a few changes to make eating easier. Smaller, more frequent meals instead of 3 larger ones. Softer foods that required less work to break down. Sipping fluids slowly during meals instead of gulping them, and most importantly, taking the pancreatic enzyme supplements before every bite. George followed her advice carefully. He began eating smaller portions, sometimes just half a sandwich or a small bowl of soup, with a short rest afterward. It helped, but the nausea still found its way in some days, lingering like a stubborn shadow. Emily stepped in with her own quiet solutions. She prepared gentle meals, mashed sweet potatoes, poached chicken, smooth butternut squash soup that were easier on his system. She brewed ginger tea, which seemed to settle his stomach in the evenings. And sometimes she simply sat with him after meals, talking softly until the uneasy feeling passed. But beyond the physical discomfort, the nausea brought something else George hadn't expected. A quiet erosion of joy. Food had always been one of life's pleasures for him, not just for the taste, but for the way it brought people together. Now he found himself dreading mealtimes, worried about what might follow. One Sunday, Emily invited him to a family lunch. She had prepared all his favorites, hoping to tempt his appetite. The table was beautiful: roast chicken, fresh bread, colorful salads. George took a small plate, choosing carefully. The first few bites were pleasant enough, but halfway through, that familiar queasiness crept in. He set down his fork and folded his hands in his lap, trying to disguise his discomfort. Emily caught his eye and gave a small, understanding nod. She didn't press him to eat more. Instead, she kept the conversation light, making sure he still felt part of the gathering. Later, she quietly packed a small plate of leftovers for him to take home. That evening, as George sat in his garden with a cup of ginger tea, he thought about how much had changed. Meals were no longer about indulgence or even simple satisfaction. They were about strategy, about making choices that might let him enjoy a moment without paying for it afterward. Still, he found ways to adapt. He discovered that eating earlier in the evening gave his body more time to settle before bed. He learned that cold foods, like cottage cheese with berries or chilled melon, were sometimes easier than hot, heavy dishes. And he began to focus less on the size of the meal and more on the moments that surrounded it. The conversation, the company, the sunlight through the kitchen window. Dr. Alvarez reminded him, "George, nausea is your body's way of telling you it's struggling. Listen to it, work with it, not against it. That's how you'll find a rhythm that works for you." Those words stayed with him. He realized he couldn't force his body to accept food the way it used to, but he could be patient with it, offering kindness instead of frustration. One warm afternoon, while sitting on his porch, George noticed a butterfly hovering over a flower. It landed briefly, then fluttered away, only to return moments later. It seemed to be testing the air, finding just the right moment to drink. George smiled faintly. Maybe that was what he needed to do with food: approach it gently, without rushing, and take only what his body could welcome. In time, the nausea became something he could navigate, if not entirely avoid. And while it still stole some of the joy from mealtimes, it also taught him something important: that caring for himself now meant more than just eating to live. It meant listening closely, honoring his limits, and savoring the small comforts, like the warmth of ginger tea in his hands or the quiet presence of his daughter nearby. And in those small comforts, George found a different kind of nourishment, one that went beyond the plate. The itching began so faintly that George barely noticed it at first. A small tickle on his forearm, a subtle scratch at the back of his neck. It came and went without fanfare, like a passing thought you forget almost as soon as it appears. But over the next few weeks, it grew more persistent. Not the kind of itching that comes from a mosquito bite or dry winter air, but a deep, nagging irritation that seemed to live just beneath the skin. Some nights, it would wake him from sleep. He'd find himself rubbing his arms, his back, even the soles of his feet, trying to quiet the strange sensation. At first, he tried the usual remedies: moisturizing lotion, oatmeal soap, even the aloe gel Emily swore by in the summer. They brought brief relief, but the itching always returned, often worse at night when the house was still and the darkness seemed to make every sensation sharper. One afternoon, while sitting with Emily over tea, George absently scratched the side of his arm. She noticed immediately. "Dad, you've been doing that a lot lately," she said. "Doing what?" he asked. "Scratching. You okay?" "Just a little itchy. Probably the change in weather," he replied, though he knew the truth was murkier. At his next appointment, he mentioned it casually to Dr. Alvarez, expecting her to wave it off. Instead, she leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "George, itching like this, especially if it's all over and there's no rash, can sometimes be linked to a buildup of bile salts in the skin. This happens when the bile ducts are partially blocked, which can occur with certain pancreatic conditions. You've already had some signs of this with the jaundice we saw earlier." Her words settled over him like a slow dawn. He remembered how she had explained that the yellowing in his skin and eyes was caused by bile backing up into the bloodstream. Now she was telling him that same buildup could be triggering the itching. It wasn't just an annoyance, it was another part of the same story his body had been telling all along. Dr. Alvarez explained that when bile salts circulate in the blood instead of flowing freely into the intestines, they can irritate nerve endings in the skin. "It's not harmful in itself," she reassured him, "but it can be very uncomfortable, and it's a sign we need to keep an eye on your bile duct function." George nodded slowly, feeling both relieved to have an explanation and unsettled by the reminder of how interconnected all his symptoms were. This wasn't just random bad luck, it was his pancreas casting shadows in unexpected places. She suggested a few strategies to help manage the itching: cooler showers, loose cotton clothing, avoiding harsh soaps, and taking prescribed medications that could help lower the level of bile salts in his system. George followed her advice faithfully. He swapped his hot showers for lukewarm ones, even though he missed the comfort of the steam. He began wearing softer shirts, choosing breathable fabrics that didn't cling. He even tried sleeping with a small fan running at night to keep his skin cool. The changes helped, but the itching never fully disappeared. Some days it was a whisper in the background, other days it was loud enough to make him want to scratch until his skin was red. One night, lying awake in bed, George found himself reflecting on how something so small, a simple itch, could wear a person down. It wasn't just the sensation itself, but the way it gnawed at his peace, pulling at his attention even in quiet moments. He thought about the many signs his body had given him over the past months: the back pain, the indigestion, the weight loss, the greasy stools, the jaundice. Each had been a thread, weaving together the larger picture of his illness, and now the itching had joined them, a reminder that even the smallest discomfort can carry meaning. Emily, ever attentive, found small ways to help. She brought him gentle, fragrance-free creams and made him chamomile compresses to soothe his skin. Sometimes she'd sit with him in the evening, reading aloud while he rested with a cool cloth on his arms. It wasn't a cure, but it was comfort. One afternoon, George was tending to his garden when a light breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the soft scent of blooming roses. For a moment, he forgot about the itching. He stood there, eyes closed, breathing deeply. It struck him then that his illness was like his garden in midsummer, alive with beauty, but also vulnerable to pests, weeds, and weather. You couldn't control everything, but you could tend it with care, doing what you could to keep it healthy. The itching, he realized, was another signpost. Not one to fear, but one to respect. It was his body's way of reminding him that even small discomforts deserved attention, because they often pointed toward something deeper. Later that week, as he sat on his porch watching the late daylight stretch across the yard, George ran his fingers lightly along his arm. The irritation was there, but he found he could breathe through it. He could accept it as part of the rhythm of his days now, one more reminder that his body was still speaking, still asking him to listen. And in listening, he found a measure of peace. The swelling began in George's right ankle. At first, he thought little of it. He'd been on his feet for much of the morning, tidying the kitchen and watering his plants. By evening, his ankle looked puffy, the skin faintly stretched, but he assumed it would fade overnight. It didn't. The next morning, the swelling was still there, slightly worse if anything. By late afternoon, his left ankle had joined in, and his calves felt heavy, as though he were wearing invisible sandbags. Walking became awkward, and bending down to tie his shoes left him feeling stiff and unsteady. Emily noticed immediately when she stopped by. "Dad, what happened to your legs?" she asked, kneeling to take a closer look. Her fingers pressed gently against his shin, and a shallow dent remained in the skin. "That's not nothing," she said firmly. George shrugged, trying for lightness. Probably just fluid from standing too long. But the truth was, the swelling made him uneasy. He could feel a faint tightness in his calves, a sensation that wasn't exactly painful but far from normal. When he mentioned it to Dr. Alvarez, her expression turned serious. She asked if the swelling had come on suddenly, whether he'd experienced any tenderness or warmth in the legs, and if the swelling was worse in one side than the other. George described his symptoms, and she nodded slowly. "George, swelling like this, especially when it's new and comes with heaviness, can sometimes be linked to a blood clot in the deep veins of the legs. We call it deep vein thrombosis, or DVT. People with pancreatic cancer have a higher risk because the cancer can make the blood more likely to clot." Her words landed with a weight that matched the heaviness in his legs. Blood clots weren't something to brush aside. They could travel to the lungs and become life-threatening. Dr. Alvarez arranged for an urgent ultrasound of his legs. The test confirmed her suspicion. A clot in one of the deeper veins of his right calf. She explained the treatment plan: blood-thinning medication to prevent the clot from growing and to reduce the risk of new ones forming, along with gentle activity to keep the blood moving. "You'll need to be careful," she cautioned. "Listen to your body. If you feel sudden shortness of breath, chest pain, or dizziness, call emergency services immediately." George absorbed her words, a mix of relief at having an explanation and sobering awareness of the new risk he was facing. At home, the swelling became part of his daily reality. Some mornings, his legs felt almost normal. Other days, they seemed to carry the weight of the world. He learned to elevate them while reading in his recliner, propping them up on pillows in bed, and wearing compression stockings as Dr. Alvarez had suggested. Emily helped however she could, massaging his calves gently, fetching extra pillows, and encouraging him to walk slowly around the house to keep his circulation moving. "You're not sitting still all day," she would remind him with a smile, "but you're also not pushing too hard." The clot and swelling brought a new layer to George's understanding of his illness. It wasn't just about the tumor, it was about the ripple effects through his entire body. His blood, his digestion, his energy, even his skin and eyes had been touched by this one hidden enemy. One afternoon, George sat on his porch with a cup of tea, his legs propped comfortably on a stool. The garden stretched before him, bathed in late daylight. He thought about how, in his years of tending plants, he had learned that a problem in one part of a plant could affect the whole. Wilting leaves from damaged roots, stunted blooms from poor soil. The swelling in his legs was no different. It was a symptom of something deeper, a sign of the stress his whole body was under. The blood-thinning medication began to help over the following weeks. The swelling didn't disappear, but it became less severe. The tightness in his calves eased, and he could walk a little farther without discomfort. Still, the experience had left its mark on him. He was reminded daily of how quickly something could change, how easily the ordinary could become urgent. Emily often joined him for slow evening walks, the two of them moving side by side along the quiet neighborhood streets. They talked about everything: her work, the grandchildren, even memories from George's teaching days. Sometimes they walked in comfortable silence, the sound of their footsteps and the evening breeze enough to fill the space between them. George came to see these walks as more than exercise. They were a quiet act of defiance against the limitations his illness tried to impose, a way of reminding himself that movement was still possible, still valuable. Each step was both a safeguard for his health and a small declaration of resilience. One evening, as they paused to watch the sunset, Emily turned to him. "You know, Dad," she said softly, "every time I see you out here walking, I think, you're not just keeping your legs moving, you're keeping your spirit moving too." George smiled at that, feeling the truth in her words. The swelling in his legs was a reminder of his vulnerability. Yes, but it was also a reminder that he could respond, adapt, and keep going. And in that quiet moment, with the last light fading over the rooftops and his daughter at his side, he decided that was exactly what he would keep doing. George had always imagined that if something serious was wrong inside his body, he'd feel it sharply, like an alarm bell going off. But over the past months, he'd learned that wasn't how it worked, at least not with pancreatic cancer. This illness didn't shout in the beginning. It whispered: the back pain, the indigestion, the yellow eyes, the weight loss, the fatigue, the swelling in his legs. Each was a fragment of the truth, but none of them alone told the whole story. It was the doctors who had pieced it together, connecting the dots with skill, patience, and the help of modern medical tools. George remembered the first time Dr. Alvarez explained how pancreatic cancer is detected. They were sitting in her office, the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun, a file of test results open on her desk. "The challenge," she said gently, "is that the pancreas is tucked deep inside the abdomen, behind the stomach. We can't feel it during a regular checkup the way we might detect an enlarged liver or swollen lymph nodes. We have to look for it in other ways." For George, that process had begun with blood work, routine at first, then more specialized. The standard tests had picked up small irregularities, but nothing conclusive. Then came the CA-19-9 test, a tumor marker often elevated in pancreatic cancer. His levels were higher than normal. "It doesn't confirm cancer on its own," Dr. Alvarez told him, "but it gives us another piece of the puzzle." Next came imaging. The abdominal ultrasound was the first step, simple, painless, and quick. It had shown some changes near the pancreas, but not enough detail to be certain. So Dr. Alvarez had ordered a CT scan. George still remembered lying on the table as the machine hummed and the contrast dye warmed his veins. The images revealed a suspicious mass in the head of his pancreas. Even then, they needed to know more. An MRI provided additional clarity, showing the size of the mass and its relationship to nearby structures. Later, he underwent an endoscopic ultrasound. A slender scope passed down his throat and into his stomach to get high-resolution images of the pancreas from just millimeters away. The gastroenterologist had even taken a small tissue sample, a biopsy, for the lab to examine under a microscope. That biopsy was the turning point. The cells confirmed what they had suspected: pancreatic adenocarcinoma. Hearing those words had been like having the air punched out of him. But strangely, there was also relief in knowing the truth. At least now the mystery had a name. And with that name came a plan. Imperfect, uncertain, but a plan nonetheless. Dr. Alvarez explained that early detection was rare with pancreatic cancer because symptoms often didn't appear until the disease was advanced. But when it was caught early, sometimes by accident during tests for another condition, there was a better chance of removing the tumor surgically or slowing its progress with treatment. George thought about how many people must walk around with the earliest whispers of the disease, not realizing what was happening. It made him grateful, in a bittersweet way, that his symptoms had piled up enough to raise alarms. He also learned that people at higher risk, those with a family history, certain genetic mutations, chronic pancreatitis, or long-standing diabetes, could sometimes benefit from screening even before symptoms appeared. But for most, like him, detection depended on noticing subtle changes and seeking help quickly. Emily had been a driving force in that. She was the one who pushed him to see the doctor when the weight loss started, who noticed the yellow in his eyes before he did, who sat beside him through each test and gently reminded him that answers, however difficult, were better than uncertainty. One afternoon, while waiting for a follow-up appointment, George found himself talking to another patient in the clinic. The man was about his age and was there for a different reason, but they struck up an easy conversation. When George mentioned his diagnosis, the man frowned. "How'd they find it? My cousin died from that. They didn't know until it was too late." George explained the process, how one symptom had led to another, how the doctors had used each clue to decide the next step. "It wasn't one big test that told them," he said. "It was a trail of breadcrumbs. And thank God I followed it, even when I wanted to tell myself it was nothing." Back in Dr. Alvarez's office, they reviewed his most recent scans. The tumor was still there, stubborn as ever, but at least now they could see it clearly and monitor it closely. She talked about possible treatments, about keeping a close watch for any spread, about adjusting plans as needed. George realized then that detecting pancreatic cancer early was like finding a hidden leak in the roof. You couldn't fix it if you didn't know it was there, and the sooner you knew, the better your chances of preventing greater damage. It wasn't about waiting for the ceiling to collapse. It was about noticing the faint water stain in the corner and calling someone before the next storm hit. That night, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea, George made a note in his journal. Don't ignore the breadcrumbs. They lead somewhere important. He thought about all the small ways he had been guided toward the truth, by his own observations, by Emily's watchful eyes, by Dr. Alvarez's persistence. And he promised himself that if he ever had the chance, he would encourage others to follow their own trails, however faint. Because sometimes the smallest clue could be the difference between knowing in time and finding out too late. When George first heard the word cancer come out of Dr. Alvarez's mouth, the last thing on his mind was lifestyle changes. In those early days, the news was too big, too heavy. He thought about treatment, about the odds, about how to tell Emily. He wasn't thinking about what he ate for breakfast or how often he walked. But as the weeks passed, something shifted. Once the whirlwind of tests and diagnoses settled, George began to see his life in two parts. The one before he knew, and the one after. In the after part, every choice seemed to matter more. One afternoon, Emily came over with a grocery bag and began unpacking fresh produce. Deep green kale, bright carrots, plump tomatoes, and a small jar of almonds. "Dad," she said gently, "I've been reading. There's a lot you can't control about this, but there are some things you can. Let's start with food." George looked at the colorful pile on the counter and gave a half smile. "So you're telling me potato chips don't make the cut?" "Not unless you want to live on them for nostalgia's sake," she replied, laughing softly. It wasn't just about eating healthy in a vague sense. Dr. Alvarez had explained that a diet rich in whole foods, fresh vegetables, lean proteins, whole grains, healthy fats, could help support his strength, keep his weight more stable, and reduce inflammation. Processed foods, sugary snacks, and excess alcohol were best left for rare occasions, if at all. She also encouraged George to stay as active as he comfortably could. "You don't have to run marathons," she told him. "Just keep moving. Movement helps your circulation, your mood, and even your digestion." So George made a few changes, quietly but steadily. He started his mornings with a short walk around the block, sometimes with Emily, sometimes alone with his thoughts. He found that the cool air and early light lifted his mood in ways he hadn't expected. He began eating smaller, more frequent meals, grilled fish with roasted vegetables, oatmeal with berries, lentil soup with a slice of whole grain bread. He noticed he felt less sluggish after eating, and the nausea that had been plaguing him eased slightly on good days. Hydration became another quiet focus. He kept a jug of filtered water on the counter, sipping regularly instead of gulping down large amounts at once. Emily introduced him to herbal teas, ginger for his stomach, chamomile for rest, peppermint for a touch of energy. But lifestyle changes weren't just about food and movement. George started looking at his days differently. He gave himself permission to rest without guilt, to step back from tasks that drained him, to say no when he needed to. He began going to bed earlier, letting his body dictate its rhythms instead of pushing through exhaustion. Stress, Dr. Alvarez had reminded him, could be as hard on the body as poor diet. So George experimented with quiet moments of mindfulness, sitting in his garden, watching the breeze ripple through the leaves, focusing on his breathing. Some days it was 5 minutes, some days longer, but each time he felt a little lighter afterward. He also started talking openly about his feelings, something he'd never been particularly good at. Over tea with Emily, he shared the worries that kept him awake at night, the frustration of losing strength, the gratitude for small moments of peace. He found that speaking his thoughts aloud seemed to loosen their grip on him. Still, George knew that lifestyle changes weren't magic. They couldn't erase the tumor or guarantee a cure. But they were something he could do, small acts of defiance against the helplessness that sometimes threatened to take over. One crisp autumn morning, George stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden. The roses were fading now, the petals dropping quietly into the soil. He thought about how each season asked something different of the plants. Sunlight in summer, pruning in winter, a deep soak of rain in spring. Maybe people were the same. In this season of his life, his body was asking for different things than it once had. Gentler food, slower walks, more rest, less noise. Later that week, during a check-in with Dr. Alvarez, he mentioned the changes he'd made. She nodded approvingly. "George, you're doing exactly what I'd hope. None of this replaces treatment, but it supports your body in the fight. Think of it as tending the soil so the plant can grow stronger roots." Her gardening metaphor made him smile. It was a language he understood well. One evening, Emily brought over a homemade vegetable stew. As they ate together, she asked, "Do you think all these changes are making a difference?" George thought for a moment. "Physically, some days yes, some days no. But mentally, definitely. I feel like I'm part of my own care. I'm not just waiting for things to happen to me, I'm doing what I can, however small." That, he realized, was the heart of it. Lifestyle changes weren't about guarantees. They were about taking back a little agency, a little hope. They were about showing up for himself each day in the ways he could. And as he cleared the dishes that night, he felt a quiet satisfaction. In a journey with so many unknowns, these small, deliberate choices were something solid he could hold on to. It was a gray November morning when George sat down at his kitchen table with a fresh cup of tea and his worn leather notebook. He had been keeping notes for months now about his symptoms, his treatments, his walks in the park, even about which soups Emily made him feel better. But this morning, the notebook felt heavier in his hands. He knew it was time to write something more than updates. He took a slow sip of tea, set the mug down, and began with a simple sentence. Don't wait. That, he realized, was the urgent step he wished he'd taken earlier. Not waiting to see if the pain went away. Not waiting until the yellow in his eyes was obvious in the mirror. Not waiting until the weight loss and fatigue became impossible to ignore. The small signs had been there for months, whispers from his body asking for attention, but he had told himself to be patient, to give it time, to wait and see. Now he understood how costly that waiting could be. The truth was, early action doesn't always guarantee a cure with pancreatic cancer. George knew that. But he also knew that acting sooner gave you a chance, sometimes the only chance, to catch it before it became unmovable. Waiting, on the other hand, almost always worked in the cancer's favor. That afternoon, Emily came over with a loaf of fresh bread. They sat at the table, the steam from their tea curling in the air between them. George told her about the sentence he'd written. She nodded slowly. "I think that's exactly it, Dad. People ignore things because they're afraid, or they think they're overreacting, or they don't want to be a bother." He gave a small, rueful smile. "That's me. I didn't want to trouble anyone." Emily reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Troubling someone is better than losing them." Those words stayed with George long after she left. That evening, he opened his notebook again and wrote a short letter, not to himself this time, but to anyone who might one day walk the same uncertain path. If you feel something's not right, go. Don't let politeness, pride, or fear hold you back. Tell your doctor. Push for tests. Push for answers. You know your body better than anyone else, and if it's telling you something, listen. In the weeks that followed, George began sharing his story more openly. He told his neighbors, his old teaching colleagues, even the barista at the cafe he visited once a week. Not in a way that demanded sympathy, but in a way that encouraged them to be vigilant about their own health. One afternoon, while sitting on his porch, he spoke with his friend Harold from down the street. Harold had been ignoring some digestive issues, chalking them up to getting older. George told him about his own reluctance, about how waiting had given the cancer more time. Harold listened quietly, then promised to book an appointment. Moments like that reminded George why speaking up mattered. He couldn't change the road he was on, but he could perhaps make someone else's shorter and easier. Meanwhile, he continued taking small but deliberate steps in his own care, following his treatment plan, sticking to his gentler diet, and listening closely to his body's cues. Every action, no matter how small, was part of his fight. Dr. Alvarez often reminded him, "George, living with this isn't just about the treatments. It's about staying engaged, being proactive. That's how we keep ahead, even in little ways." Some days, being proactive meant calling the clinic when something felt different. Other days, it meant resting more, eating nourishing food, or saying no to plans that would leave him exhausted. It was all part of the same urgent step, refusing to be passive about his own health. By late winter, George had made a quiet ritual of standing in his garden each morning, even if only for a few minutes. The cold air cleared his mind, and the sight of bare branches reminded him that seasons always turn. One day soon, buds would appear again. Life would keep moving, and so would he. One evening, as he sat with Emily by the fireplace, she asked him if he had any regrets. He thought about it for a while before answering. "I regret the time I lost by waiting, but I'm grateful for the time I've gained by finally acting. And if my story can push someone else to act sooner, then maybe it's worth something." Emily smiled softly. "It's worth everything, Dad." In the quiet that followed, George felt a deep sense of peace. The urgent step wasn't just about medical action, it was about deciding every day to live with intention, to notice, to respond, to take care of himself, and to encourage others to do the same. Because when it comes to the whispers of your body, the smallest step you take today could be the one that changes everything tomorrow. And that, he knew, was worth saying again and again, don't wait. From the first whisper of back pain to the yellowing in his eyes, George's journey has been one of small signs that told a much bigger story. He began as a man who believed aches, indigestion, and fatigue were just the cost of growing older. But as the months unfolded, each symptom revealed itself as a thread in the same tapestry, pancreatic cancer quietly making its presence known. Along the way, George faced moments of uncertainty and fear. He learned that greasy stools weren't just a digestive quirk, that sudden diabetes could signal more than a blood sugar problem, that swelling in the legs might be a warning from deep within the veins. These weren't isolated events. They were connected, forming a pattern his doctors patiently helped him see. And through it all, George changed. He went from waiting and wondering to listening and acting. He found strength in small lifestyle shifts, gentler meals, steady walks, mindful rest, and discovered that asking for help wasn't weakness but wisdom. He began sharing his story, not for sympathy, but in the hope that someone else might hear their own body's whispers a little sooner. If you take just one thing from George's journey, let it be this: your body speaks in signals, sometimes soft, sometimes insistent. Don't brush them aside. Don't wait for them to grow louder. Act, ask, investigate. The earlier you seek answers, the greater your chances of protecting your health and your future. For seniors especially, awareness is one of the greatest tools you have. Listen closely. Trust your instincts. And if something doesn't feel right, take that urgent step toward care today. It's not just about adding years to your life, it's about adding life to your years.